Okay, recording is on, so that when this is all finished, we will post it to our website so other people can check it out then. But I'll get this going. Everyone, welcome to this afternoon's Faculty Network webinar, the first of the new academic year, and definitely not the last of them. We've got a number of them upcoming during the fall, and I'm excited to be back on the road with this webinar series. I'm gonna get right into it by handing it over to Komi German, but briefly as a preface, we're here today to talk about the Scholars Under Fire database, which is a new project that that FIRE has unveiled in the last handful of weeks. And it's the product of, among other things, a beefing up of the research capabilities within FIRE, part of which hinged around the hiring of Komi German, who is our guest today. So Komi, first, before you get into the findings and the methodology of the Scholars Under Fire project, maybe first, since you're still relatively new to FIRE, you could just give our attendees a little bit of your academic background and what got you here, your kind of research interests generally, and how they led you to this project.
Sure, absolutely. So thank you, Peter, for the introduction. Yeah, my name is Komi German. I just joined FIRE in February of this year. And before that, I had completed my PhD from the University of California, Riverside. And that was in October of 2020. And for my dissertation research, I was really interested, similar to what I do at FIRE now, in faculty. And in particular, for my dissertation research, I was interested in how faculty privately perceive a range of highly contentious campus policies that surround diversity, equity, and inclusion. These are very complicated sorts of policies, things like affirmative action, things like diversity statements, bias response teams and reporting systems, things that potentially have a lot of costs and benefits for people to weigh. So my research leading up to my work at FIRE has really been in trying to understand the nuances that kind of underlie faculty's perceptions of these really contentious issues. And I found that basically what tends to shape faculty's perceptions of these issues is how they weigh potentially competing values. These values being their more progressive social kind of political commitments on the one hand, and then their more traditional academic commitments on the other. And so sometimes these values come in conflict, and it's really difficult for them to decide which values should take priority. And so I, through my research, was able to kind of outline different ways in which faculty negotiate these conflicts. And now moving on to my research at FIRE, I'm still really interested in faculty. I'm still really interested in nuance. I think that's one commonality. And so my research in my dissertation was qualitative, and my main contribution to this Scholars in the FIRE research has really been the qualitative component as well. I believe that quantitative research has really been informative for looking at broad trends. And so I'm not trying to discount the value of it, but I think qualitative research through my dissertation, also through Scholars in the FIRE research, really reveals the particular aspects of like each person's circumstance, each person's kind of, in the case of my dissertation, their thought process. In the case of the Scholars in the FIRE database, all the different contextual factors, the intention, the scholar's response, how the administration responded, these kind of details that you can look at a broader level, which we did in the report, but you can also look at on the individual level. And that's something that I think is very unique and beneficial about this database, is that we have the report. You can look at the broad trends, which are all available in the report, like the key summary or the executive summary provides like an overview of those things, which are very important and informative and in some cases alarming. But for the database, you can really, for each instant, you can see, the topic, the subject, the intention, the politics, what the scholar said in its original format, how the administration responded, what the ultimate outcome was. Like these really interesting, informative details that I think are often lost on more big picture research. So, one reason I'm really excited about the Scholars on Fire project is that we can offer this broader, like quantitative, zoomed out look, which we do in the report, but also offer a nuance, offer the specific details pertaining to each incident and make that publicly available, which is really exciting, I think. And I think that's why this project, we hope, will be a really good resource. I think there's a difference between essentially being able to see numbers, seeing, wow, like this number of scholars were impacted, or this number of scholars did this and were impacted, things like that. That's telling, and it's important to know that. But I think when you know like who this person was, like what's their name, like what did they post on social media, what did they tell a student, what were they trying to do, what was their intention? When you see all these details, you actually, it becomes like more personal, it becomes more relatable. That's something where with this database, when you're looking through cases, I think no matter where you fall on the political spectrum, you can see like somebody who you resonate with, whether it's somebody who said something you would say or have said, or somebody whose words you sympathize with and maybe would be afraid to say, and maybe would be afraid to say because of exactly reasons why they were targeted. So the hope is that this database like brings awareness to the personal aspects and the relatability of these scholars. They're human beings. And these are very complicated cases as well. And so I just hope that our database does a really good job of conveying the complexity and the nuance. And
before you get into the methodology and the findings of the report, I wonder if you could give a little bit of background on what motivated it in the first place, because I know this research incorporates and takes into account research that has been done by a number of other organizations, a number of other independent scholars, and faculty at other university centers. So I wonder if you could first, before going into the nuts and bolts of the report, just sort of talk about how the process of how it took shape within FIRE and what led to the decision that that this was a worthwhile project to pursue.
Sure, that's a great question. And when I began in February, I was fortunate to be joining a project that was already in the works. So my colleague Sean Stevens, he is like the mastermind behind the like original idea of this project. He and his former PhD advisor Lee Jessam had been studying this issue and had written about this issue as well, about like self-censorship and censorship broadly in academia, and they were alarmed about the sort of trend they were seeing that was somewhat anecdotal or was somewhat incomplete based on the existing databases. And so he just began kind of tracking these cases informally, just because he thought it was an interesting and growing problem to document. And then, Greg Lukianoff, he became really interested as well. It became like a massive project that I, joined FIRE to really help develop. And so initially we were looking at some of the more, basic fundamental aspects of each case, things like the university where the incident occurred, the year, the field, like the department, the scholar's race and gender, things like that. And then, when I joined, because I have the qualitative background, I was really interested in sort of expanding the kinds of things that we were interested in measuring. And so the project kind of took a route, very much as a partnership, but was initially kind of Sean Stevens' brainchild, so to speak.
Okay, great. I won't hold you up anymore with that. Why don't you get into the methodology? The methodology first, and then we can go into some of the key findings from it.
Sure, absolutely. So for each of these, what amounted to 426 incidents, we relied primarily on like public news stories or publicly available information. So we did not like conduct any studies or any surveys we just kind of, it was almost like using, I guess you could say, like archival data and some obviously recent news stories as well. And so for each incident, as I mentioned, in addition to coding the basics or demographic characteristics of each faculty, we also were interested in what was the topic of their expression, who was the subject of their expression, what was the context in which the expression occurred, what was the intent of the scholar's expression, were there any petitions supporting the professor or opposing the professor, of course. How did the professor respond to the targeting attempt? How did the administration respond to the targeting attempt? Who was a source of the targeting? What specific demand did they have? And ultimately, what was the outcome of the incident? So these were a lot of really important details that we coded for each incident. And we did rely on publicly available information, which for the most part wasn't a limitation. We were able to gather this information for virtually all of this information for virtually every incident. And so that was what our methodology was. We felt that each of these categories each of these descriptors were really important. So we developed like a coding scheme so that, let's say, for example, when it comes to intention, we weren't just choosing a bunch of random intentions. We had, I think it was approximately like 7 intentions that we wanted to distinguish between. And so we had things like benign intention, malicious intention, pedagogical intention, scientific inquiry as the intention, so things like that. And so we were able to somewhat standardize this process of coding very rich material. And we did that for all the variables so that not only could we analyze these variables for the report, but also so that for the public to see each incident, we have these different categories, these different descriptions listed, and you can see how they kind of relate across cases. So you can search a database, for example, if you're interested in people who were sanctioned because of their scientific inquiry, you can type that in and you can see all the scholars who were sanctioned on that basis or who were targeted on that basis. So we tried to make it, let's say, like a balance between being very qualitative and rich and also being systematic, so that we can still look at patterns and make it easy for people to search on the basis of those patterns.
Okay.
So that's very broadly what our methodology entailed.
Okay. And maybe now go into because probably some people here will be a little bit familiar with it, but others maybe not so much. So maybe some of the top line findings, in terms of major data points or trends that you found in the research.
Sure, of course. I think the main one would be that the number of incidents have increased. So the total number of incidents we record is 426, but we have seen a drastic increase over time. So the first year we collected this data from is 2015. There were only 24 incidents in 2015, and now if we go to 2020, we only have data through half of 2021. So through 2020, in that year alone, we had 113 incidents. So we see a drastic increase in the number of incidents. We also see that a lot of these incidents, almost 3/4 of them, result in some form of sanction. And these sanctions include, or maybe should say, range from an investigation to termination. And so some of the sanctions between would be things like censorship, suspension, and I believe there are a few other ones that are kind of in between the range of investigation and termination. And we did, I should note, include investigation as a form of a sanction, even if the investigation resulted in the scholar being cleared. And the reasons that an investigation we determined was it was itself a form of punishment, and it's a very intense, stressful process to have imposed on a person that oftentimes isn't warranted. So that's why we include it as a form of sanction. So those are a couple of the main findings as well. There was a high incidence of expression pertaining to race that was a catalyst for sanction attempts. Also, there was partisanship, gender, and institutional policy. Those are also pretty hot button issues. And going forward, there are a few, it's likely there's some other issues that will be kind of on the forefront. I'd say for the rest of 2020, I think probably COVID will continue to be a major hot button issue, as well as perhaps abortion. But that's more of my prediction than it is anything that we recorded from the report. Another important finding is when it comes to the intention, that the majority, approximately I believe it was 2/3 of the incidents involved scholars being targeted because of their personal beliefs they expressed. But then half the incidents involved people engaging in what we call scientific inquiry and/or pedagogy. So basically, scientific inquiry involves asking a question or posing an idea that's an empirical question that can be tested, or asking a question that can be tested empirically. Pedagogy involves teaching practices, broadly defined, teaching behaviors, exams, still by things like that. So those are some of the main, I think, findings that were the most, I think, noteworthy.
And so to everyone else here, something I should have said at the outset. This is a fairly free-flowing discussion. But if you came with questions, feel free to put them in the question and answer field, and we will do our best to get to all of them. Sorry, I should have said that at the outset. Komi, one thing that I noted when we were going, when I was going through the report and going through some of the figures today, was that the number of these incidents we saw went up significantly last year, which, knowing what I do and remembering how last year was in terms of everything that was going on politically, going on in terms of the wider culture, in terms of racial justice protests, the way they played out nationally, the way they played out on a lot of campuses. It was a very contentious election year. There was a pandemic raging. There was plenty to be upset about last year. And in the course of that, we saw it fire a record number of submissions. And I think that, at least in terms of, in terms of the number of inquiries coming through FIRE, it has sort of leveled off and come down a little bit from last year, just in terms of the sheer volume of these we're getting. But also going by the report, it doesn't seem to think that that the number of these kinds of targeting incidents has leveled off to the same extent. Is that right? I think the report says it's sort of on that same path.
Yeah. So as of mid 2020, all of the or the number of incidents look like they're on par to be roughly equivalent to what 2020 was. Interesting.
One question that I've had come in, and this is a good one. Are there plans to continue adding to the database as we have more of these incidents?
Yes, absolutely. And so, we're thinking that we might do like an annual report, but in addition to that, every month or so, we're going to be launching kind of the official update. And so, during this official update, we'll be including all of the incidents that have happened in that prior month, as well as any changes, any updates to existing cases we have in the database. Because some scholars who maybe were suspended when we initially published the database have since been terminated or have since been reinstated. So we'll be sort of launching an official update every month, which includes the cases that are most recent, as well as the new changes that need to be made. We're also welcoming people to submit to scholarsunderfire@thefire.org. That's our email. Any cases that they think should be added that currently are not, or on a regular basis, any cases that come up that they know of, we'll probably be aware of them too. But just in case, we know that we don't catch everything that's covered in news stories or published in maybe smaller outlets. And so we really do welcome people to help us gather as complete of information as possible. And we will continue to be updating. We're also hoping to be backfilling from before 2015, just to really, basically the goal is to make the database as comprehensive as possible in terms of what we cover, the accuracy, as well as the timeline.
Well, good. I'm glad that it's going to be a living resource because and I'm gonna share this with the attendees. We wrote about it. A lot of other places have written about it, but you might have seen that at Syracuse University over last weekend there was a controversy over one of its professors posting criticisms of the U.S. media and the U.S. political establishment's response to 9/11, which not so surprisingly, unfortunately, elicited a strong pushback and resulted in a lot of people on social media, a lot of public figures, organizations like the New York State Republican Party calling for the university to fire the professor, and Syracuse, fortunately, coming to the professor's defense and not committing to any kind of investigation or sanction. So I like to think this is something that shouldn't end up in the database on that score if there was no investigation and no sanction. But nonetheless, I think the incident shows that this is these kind of incidents are going to continue to happen, and we're going to do our best to to keep cataloging them and make this as comprehensive a resource as we can.
Yeah, and I should add also that this professor at Syracuse, she may be included in the update regardless of whether the university acts. And the reason is I have to check all the details, but the reason is that we may have concrete evidence that there were public calls for her to be terminated or otherwise sanctioned. And if we have that evidence, so in the form of a petition or other documented evidence, she will be included in the database. And what we'll do is we would code that as the administration response being, if it continues to be as it has been, the administrative response will be supportive or defend the professor's speech rights. The outcome will be no sanctions, but she could still be included if there was a formal attempt at sanctioning her.
Got it. Thank you for the clarification. Everyone, listen to her. She did the study and she wrote the report, so don't listen to my paraphrasing. But the this gets to, I think, one of the key kind of divides, or one of the key takeaways for me in the report is that talking about these things in terms of left and right is a bit of a foreign, is a little bit of a foreign language to me. I tend not to look at our work in those terms because that often doesn't capture the whole. It doesn't capture the essence of the whole, of the whole issue. Frequently, politics and partisanship don't play a particular role in our casework. In terms of the cases that come to us, the cases we take, obviously. But one thing that I've noticed a lot, and it shows up in this report, is that if these campaigns are targeting scholars, from the scholars left, let's say, they tend to come from inside the institution, and if they're coming from the scholars right, they tend to come from outside the institution and the general public. Can you talk maybe a little bit more about that?
Yeah, and so in a sense, that's somewhat to be expected. But I guess first I should note that the politics measure, we're not saying that it comes from the left or the right in general, but rather that it comes from groups or individuals to the right or the left of the scholar. And so many of the scholars in the database are self-proclaimed liberals, or we presume would call themselves liberals if asked, or progressives even, but may be targeted by people who are further to the left than them. Similarly, there might be somebody who's conservative who's still targeted by somebody who's further to the right than them. So it's basically all relative, which doesn't entirely remove the the imperfection of how we measure politics, or the the limitations of doing from the left or from the right. But yeah, so when it comes to scholars on campus, or people on campus, primarily targeting scholars from the left, I wouldn't say that's terribly surprising, given that a lot of research has documented that faculty and students, and especially administrators, are predominantly to the left as scholar, or sorry, to the left, period. So that finding maybe isn't terribly surprising. Then when it comes to the general public, or politicians, for example, I think that kind of reveals like a culture war that is taking place. And so outlets like Campus Reform, Breitbart, the very right-wing organizations, they have really tried to bring attention, tried to call out or cancel really scholars who they believe are quote unquote indoctrinating students. And so that has led to a lot more public, people on the right being aware and being concerned and calling for sanctions. And then of course, faculty expressing their views. If faculty tend to be on the left politically, the types of politicians that they're going to be criticizing more may tend to be on the right. So then it's not surprising that the politicians or kind of government agencies who are complaining and calling for sanctions tend to be on the right. So those findings are very interesting, and also not particularly surprising. It's just that we didn't really have as concrete of documentation as we do now. It's a classic sort of, I think, psychological study where you find something that everyone already kind of suspected was true, but we didn't have data on it, so now we do. That's
Sure.
kind of how I interpret that graph.
Sure. Okay, thank you. Yeah, another, well, let's stick with we'll stick with reports, stick with the methodology. A lot of a lot I know went into the report, went into refining every aspect of the methodology, every every criterion or condition that was considered. I went and counted them individually, and I think I came up with something like 110 or so different fields that are evaluated for each entry to be coded. Could you talk, maybe about first kind of what you think this, this does best, and then from there maybe talk about where you think it might be limited, where, what you think isn't accomplished with the work?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, in terms of what this research accomplished, I think you just pointed to it. It really is just the wealth of information that we have for each case. Just the richness of that information, and to have that all compiled in one place, and to allow people to search on the basis of whatever characteristics they're most interested in. I think that's very powerful. So you can both look at people for themselves, not just by reading the report, but by exploring the database themselves. They can identify these patterns, which is really cool. And then, so I think that would be like a huge advantage. They can look at these patterns for themselves, but they can also, like, if they're really interested in just like honing in on a specific case, because there's a professor, maybe say they're a student and they took a class with this professor, and so they really want to know everything about this incident because it obviously hits close to home for them. They can, in addition to learning about these things that we coded based on a ton of different criteria or coding options, they can see for themselves, what exactly this scholar did or said. And then we include that in like the content of the scholar's expression section, at least when it's applicable. So if a scholar posted something on Twitter, whether the scholar removed that or not. So if it's removed, then we'll keep the screenshots and we'll post those. Sometimes it's in the original format, so we'll be able to post that. That allows people to be able to read for themselves, like what does the person actually post, like what's the full post, what might the follow-up threads have been, really understand the full context in which the scholar engaged in this expression. We also provide links to news stories that way, and from a variety of sources, in terms of variety, like politically, so right-wing, left-wing, but also in terms of like the sort of magnitude of the coverage. And so, we're most interested in how the university itself covered the incident, like how the college newspaper did, the student reporters. So we list those first, and we try to include every single like article that, say, like the Harvard Crimson published, and sometimes there would be something like 8 news stories. We include all of those, usually like in chronological order, to allow people to reach their own conclusions about like understanding everything that happened and unfolded in real time. So I think that's really what the benefit of this research is allowing people to see for themselves, make their own conclusions, and just use this as a resource how they see fit. In terms of the limitations, I think one major one would be that we relied on news stories, on publicly available information. We suspect that there are far more cases that exist that were never publicized. Universities keep a lot of these things internally. So when people, try to, submit complaints and things like that, petition, the university has an incentive to prevent these things from going viral, prevent the news outlets from picking up on them, because it often brings like negative publicity to the university, and it puts them under a lot of pressure to respond in some way or another. So I think we need to have different ways of exploring, maybe through Freedom of Information Act requests, things like that, the unpublished or unpublicized incidents that have happened, to really get a sense, because I think this is the tip of the iceberg, so to really get a sense of how frequent or how pervasive this problem really is.
Sure. And I know in the however many weeks it's been since the report was issued, a number of publications, a number of scholars have been through it. There's been a lot of good feedback and some thoughtful criticism. In terms of the critiques that we've gotten on the project, could you maybe talk about which are the most salient or the most compelling to you, and how you might address those, or how you might respond to that?
Yeah, of course. So I think the most salient and, in our opinion, the most compelling criticism we've gotten was our decision to omit incidents that involved harassment that didn't also involve an attempt to professionally sanction a scholar. And so, obviously people who have been harassed for their expression, who even received death threats, are experiencing a form of being punished for their expression. And arguably the punishment they're experiencing is more severe or scarier than the threat of being killed or having your family killed, certainly arguably more severe than the threat of losing your job. And so our choice to omit those cases, obviously for some people, was seen as a gross injustice or a huge negligence on our part. And I understand where people are coming from, because it's not funny, but to joke, they called for you to be killed, but they didn't call for you to be investigated. Yeah, I can understand why that's a completely valid criticism. And the reason why, and we've been debating this for months within FIRE, all of us have been just being like, how we can best convey this information, how we can study this phenomenon. We realize that it's just, it's extremely difficult to verify the magnitude and severity of the allegations if we're just relying on publicly available information. As is, we think that the number of scholars we've included in the database is far lower than the number of scholars who've actually faced these targeting attempts. And certainly the number of scholars who've been threatened, who have been public about it, is much, much smaller than the number who really have been, because these are kinds of things that often are done privately. It's a really difficult problem to analyze because, I think it would require a separate study. And I think receiving threats is something that people aren't very willing to publicize. And so we therefore don't know how representative those who have received threats are compared to the overall population of people who've received threats. It's understandable that, if your life is threatened, you're not going to want to tell the New York Times that. So we probably have to maybe conduct like a study that ensures confidentiality, in which case we wouldn't be able to be publicly including these details in a database. And so, we really have been like thinking about how best to address this problem. And I think the best solution would be to conduct a separate investigation and maybe join forces with, an organization like the AAUP, which published a really important study looking at how a high percentage of people who were targeted by campus reform or were featured, let's say, in campus reform articles were subsequently harassed. So they've shown that this is the case. They've shown that this has a chilling effect. They haven't conducted like a systematic study of all faculty or a systematic study that's on a generalizable sample of scholars. So I think it would be really, beneficial for us to do a collaborative effort. We share the goal of really understanding this phenomenon. So I think a separate study is definitely warranted. And I know my colleague Sean Stevens and I would be really happy to do that. And I think that would be a really great way to overcome what I think is the most important limitation of this research, in addition to there obviously not being, us not being able to rely on other private sources of information.
Thank you for that. And one of our attendees says, Jess, and I'm gonna put this into the answered section of the Q&A. One of our attendees has kindly sent us some research that has been done out at the Free Speech Center at the University of California. And thank you for that. I'm actually not certain that I've read through that, so I look forward to seeing that. I had a question somewhere in my notes. While I try and find that, I will answer one other question that we've had come in. It's a fairly simple one, which is the question: are there any informal support groups that have been formed by faculty who are undergoing investigation after being targeted, falsely accused, etc.? And there are probably some that I'm not aware of. I imagine there, at a number of campuses, there are some, some sort of informal collectives that gather around these concerns. To an extent, that is. That is a role that fire can fulfill. A lot of the times, I know this because I run our faculty programming and our faculty development now, but I also worked in our individual rights defense program for 7 years before doing that. So I know how, in addition to kind of the investigative and public advocacy work that we do, a lot of it, a lot of the work amounts to acting as a kind of support system for faculty. So that's sort of one. But another another that I would say, I don't know that they would say that they have that they organize precisely for this purpose, but the Academic Freedom Alliance, which launched within the last year, they are a faculty-led collective whose mission really involves kind of being a public advocate for faculty that they see being wrongly targeted for their expression, wrongly targeted, wrongly investigated, wrongly punished. In a lot of ways that is similar, that's quite similar to what FIRE does, but it does, I agree, carry an extra bit of weight, when it comes from a body whose whole membership is faculty, signifying that there is that kind of support system, that there are kind of other faculty out there who will have your back. I think that can make a difference as well. You know, Komi, we've talked about a good number of the various findings of the report, and a lot of them, as you said, as you said a few minutes ago, it's sort of finding data to support trends that you already suspected, or that we had a sense were true. And for, having been at FIRE for 13 years, I certainly have my share of these things I sense, but but I'm not sure how well the data backs them up. Is there anything that coming from the research, coming from the reporting, that did surprise you in terms of and overall data trends?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's also, I'm sure there were findings that I couldn't have predicted, but once I discovered, wasn't surprised by. So I kind of feel like hindsight bias is influencing me a little bit. I want to think that I know more or knew more than I actually did. But since the report was published, I've been running a few kind of secondary or supplemental analyses. I've been really interested in things like how the intention of scholars' expression mapped onto the politics of the people calling for sanctions. And I think like one thing that I've been somewhat interested in, and we didn't, so these are a few things that we did not include in the report, and that people on this webinar are the first to hear about, are that the scholars who were engaging in activism, so if the reason why they were targeted pertained to their activism, they were more likely to be targeted by the right. This is something that when it comes to like the intention behind expression, maybe I could have predicted, but I was still kind of surprised to see that was the case. Like scholars engaging in activism were almost 3 times more likely to be targeted by the right than by the left. And this is surprising, especially given that there was a higher number of incidents that came from the left and the right. So activism involved typically things like advocating for Black Lives Matter, advocating for boycott, divest, and sanction, involving Israel and Palestine, other forms of activism as well. And so that was kind of an interesting partisan finding. In addition, I was somewhat surprised to see that when it came to scientific inquiry and pedagogy, the targeting attempts were more likely to come from the left politically. And so especially true on cases involving expression involving race and gender. And so for a lot of these findings, I think what's kind of interesting is that regardless of your own political affiliation, it's kind of like a projective test. So when it comes to the activism finding, the finding that scholars engaging in activism are more likely to be targeted by the right. If you are yourself somebody who's on the right, you're going to be thinking, yeah, like these are a bunch of like activist professors who are using their bullet pulpit to indoctrinate students and try to make them do things they don't want to do, or try to like make them into activists. So yeah, like no wonder, like good, almost like good for them for sanctioning these professors or trying to sanction them. If you're on the left and you hear that, you're like, these are people who have every right to be activists, and maybe they were activists like on social media in their own private lives, they had every right to, and so it's completely unjustified for people on the right to be targeting them. So it kind of is interesting how it's a projective test. And when it comes to the scientific inquiry and pedagogy, the fact that people on the left or people to the left of scholar are more likely to be targeting the scholar than people to the right of the scholar, and it's particularly true for race and gender. It's also kind of a projective test in that, like, if you are on the right, or I guess maybe I should say, like, if you're on the left, you're thinking, well, these are people who are the scholars who are targeted well, they're being targeted because they're racist and they're sexist, and they're trying to use, academic freedom through like their teaching and research to promulgate racist and sexist ideas. So that's why they're being targeted. And if you're on the right, you're thinking these are people with legitimate ideas toward race and gender who are being silenced by the left. And so, I hope this is something that was not lost in the report, that like the politics of those calling for sanctions isn't itself like a sign of anything. It really is, you can interpret it in different ways depending on who you are, depending on how you see the situation. Unfortunately, you can look at any of these incidents and decide for yourself whether the demands were warranted, whether the professor's expression was laudable, or regardless was protected.
Sure. I've had a couple of good questions just come in, but there's also one outstanding that the requester has been patient on. And just to run back through this, the question: what does punishment or censorship mean and cover? Can you just quickly run back? I think we've sort of been through this once, but if I'm correct, I think that's a question about sort of what the scope of what we call punishment is. Can you just run back through that for the people here before I get to the next couple?
Yeah, absolutely. So the punishments, and so I should note that first of all, that we included scholars regardless of whether they were ultimately sanctioned. The criteria for inclusion was whether they faced an attempt at being sanctioned, whether they were targeted. And it's a separate question whether they're targeted. It's a separate question of whether they were ultimately sanctioned, whether the targeting attempt was successful. And so when it came to let's say the outcome, because the outcome is what are the different forms of sanction that a scholar can experience. Those included things like being censored. So that can take the form of having their research be retracted, or not being able to publish research on the basis of ideological concerns. The scholar being demoted. So for example, let's say a scholar being the department head and being removed from the position as department head and still being a faculty, we still count that as a sanction because you lose that position. Another outcome, of course, is having a formal investigation conducted that you have to be involved in. You have to testify. And another outcome would be requiring the scholar not to engage in the same form of expression again. So that would be like the scholar agreeing to sign a contract that they'll never do something again, they'll never say or do something again. The scholar being required to undergo training, so in the form of like bias training or anti-bias training, sexual harassment training, things like that.
Mediation of various kinds. I've seen it all. Sure, these are all just bringing back memories of letters I've written in the past.
Yep. And and then termination of the scholar would be the most intense. I should also mention that we do include voluntary resignation of scholar. And so, one person who criticized or who's critical of our method cited a professor who ultimately resigned or voluntarily resigned a few years after the targeting incident occurred. And we did code that as ultimate sanction. The reason why she was included in the database is because there were formal attempts to sanction her. And those formal sanction attempts, even though she was never formally sanctioned by the university, those formal sanction attempts, we believed contributed to her eventual resignation. In the cases where it was clear the scholar was forced to resign, then we actually coded that as termination. So we did still keep the voluntary resignation in there as a form of, it would be called a self-imposed sanction as opposed to an institutional sanction.
Gotcha, thank you. Okay, two questions left, and I think we have time for them both. I'll go into them in the order that they came in. First question, one finding I believe was that when administrators initiated an action, it was more often to come from the right than from the left. Can you speak to that and whether that reflects some unseen pressure coming from somewhere else? I'll let you answer first, and I have a couple of thoughts I can offer on that as well.
Yeah. So I'm looking forward to your thoughts too, Peter. I think that was actually a surprising finding because a colleague of ours, Sam Abrams, he's written about how in his survey he found that administrators are extremely far to the left compared to other groups on campus, like the furthest left. And so, in a sense, it should be surprising that administrators tend to come from the right when they penalize professors or scholars. And I think what one reason could be that administrators, they are concerned about the public backlash. They're concerned about like the how, and if members of the public who will be upset will maybe be more on the right, who are already critical of what the administration does, they might want to be appeasing those groups outside, or other outside interest groups like political groups, governmental groups that they're more maybe beholden to. It's also possible that just like there's maybe a more like conservative orientation towards certain things. So people can be conservative or liberal, or right-leaning or left-leaning when it comes to different types of things. And so one quality that pertains to conservatism is respect for tradition and order, wanting to maintain order, not challenge the status quo. And in some ways, administrators are charged with upholding the system as it exists and keeping order. And so to the extent the faculty are pushing the boundaries, the administrators may find themselves in the position of trying to rein the scholars in, silence them, otherwise penalize them to keep them in check so that they don't make too much of a fuss or create difficulty. And a more liberal characteristic is wanting to challenge the status quo, wanting to make social progress and advocate for certain things that maybe go against what keeps the university in a more stable, I guess, position.
Sure. I would add to that that I think where we see a lot of this come from, whether it's in administrations, opening an investigation to sort of placate the public, or going in more seriously and levying sanctions against professors. I think my sense is we see a lot of that, particularly at public institutions, and particularly at public institutions in conservative states, where in a lot of them, the regents might be appointed by conservative governors or conservative members of the legislature, and where I think in recent years they have taken a more active stance in patrolling, trying to patrol the content of what goes on at universities, what is taught, and have been more willing to assert themselves over that. And I think probably there's, to a significant extent, administrators being kind of caught between a rock and a hard place, between having legislators breathing down their neck, threatening to pull their funds, threatening to haul them in for testimony, subpoena them, et cetera. So I think there's an extent to which it is sort of responding to that pressure coming from the more conservative direction in a way that there just isn't an analog on the left. I think a lot of it has to do with that, and I know that we have gotten more. The word that comes to mind is aggressive. I'll say more and more liberal with our use of public records requests to try and get behind the scenes on some of these things, and and they can turn up some pretty ridiculous cases. I'm sending one story to the attendees. You might have seen at Boise State University this year. The university put a hard stop for a period of time on every course of a certain classification on what turned out to be when journalists and fire got to the bottom of it through public records requests, a totally unsubstantiated rumor about a student being shamed by an instructor in class. And it being in Idaho, which has a very active state government when it comes to higher education, that's not completely surprising. Okay, thank you for that question. That's a really good one. I'm really glad that we got to talk about that for a few minutes. The last one on the dock, and this takes us back a little bit to when to your talk earlier about activism. Question I have here is, do we have a particular definition for activism? Is this, is it to an extent a definitional question? Could it be a matter of those, more on the left defining work as activism, where those on the right would not choose to use that term, even though what they're doing might well be, what you and I would call activism. Can you go into that just a little bit, maybe?
Yeah, so that's a really good point. So, well, the way we describe activism as intention very broadly would be when a scholar expressed support for a social or political cause. The question of whether perhaps, on our part, on Sean's, my part, when it came to coding, whether perhaps there were more like left-leaning causes that we would acknowledge as activism than there would be right-leaning causes we would acknowledge as activism. I think that is a legitimate concern that we were aware of as we were coding. And so, in cases where, for example, people, I can think of a few types of activism that people on the right were engaged in and we coded for, and that's actually something people can search in database as well. So activism on the right could involve, for example, like the election, in some cases, questioning the election results and trying to advocate for, a recount of the vote. That would be an example, a recent salient example of activism on the right. Although, it is possible that, not necessarily because of political bias, but just because of the way that it's just, I think, in general thought of by people on the left and right, certain causes are seen more as activism when they're on the left and on the right, or there are more like I think the major causes, especially in 2020, were on the left. So things like, Black Lives Matter, ACAB, but I guess you could also, back the blue. That would be the right leaning, analogous social cause to Black Lives Matter. So obviously that's a clear example of right-wing activism. But I think like the causes that garnered more attention and therefore perhaps more sanctioning attempts were things like Black Lives Matter, have been things like supporting the BDS movement. However, awareness of that also brings about oftentimes like a right-wing, more reactionary things. That's one way of describing it. Like, things like trying to advocate for Israel, advocate for Israeli occupation of certain territory. That is something that we would call activism that's more toward the right. So the left-leaning ones might garner more attention, but we often are able to identify from them the right-leaning, kind of reaction or comparison activism form.
Great, thank you. Well, I'm noticing that it is 5 o'clock exactly. I was, I was going to end with a big open-ended question, probably above your pay station, given you've only been with us about 7 months. So I'm not going to do that. I'll just say, hopefully, first of all, thank you to Komi for joining us this afternoon. Thank you for taking the time from your day to talk through this project with us. I found it very enlightening as a colleague of yours. And I'm looking forward to seeing where it goes, and I'm glad that it will continue to be a living resource going forward, because I don't think, obviously I don't think this is this problem is going to go away anytime soon. And hopefully we've been able to do faculty a service with putting this resource together. So with that, thank you, Komi. Thanks everyone for your excellent questions, for helping guide the discussion along. I hope it's been a good use of your time. And I'll give a little preview of of the next of these we have coming along. In the next week or two, we will. I don't mind saying this here. We will be releasing the next of our large-scale campus free speech surveys. We did 55 of these schools last year. We have something like 150 or 160 coming up this year. So it's a big report, a big project, and we're gonna put another of these together where we will bring Sean Stevens on, hopefully, to have a discussion of that project with you. And I see he's left the call, so I haven't just given him a heart attack by sort of outing that. So with that, thanks very much to everyone, and I look forward to seeing you again. And thank you again to Komi for joining.
Thank you, Peter, and everyone.